In the frozen wasteland of Finland during the winter of 1939, a single man became the embodiment of death itself. The Soviet Union had invaded with overwhelming force, over 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft, expecting to crush the small Nordic nation within weeks. What they didn't anticipate was encountering a quiet farmer who would become their worst nightmare. His name was Simo Häyhä, and by the time the snow melted, he would be credited with over 500 confirmed kills in just 100 days of combat. The Soviets called him Belia Smrt, the White Death, and his legend would force the Red Army to completely restructure their tactics in the Finnish theater of war. Before the war transformed him into a legend, Simo Häyhä was the most ordinary of men. Born in 1905 in the municipality of Rautjärvi in southern Finland, he grew up in a farming family where hard work and self-reliance were essential for survival. The Finnish countryside was unforgiving, with brutal winters that could kill the unprepared and summers so brief they felt like mere pauses between the cold. Häyhä learned to hunt from a young age, spending countless hours in the forests tracking elk and other game. In those silent woods, he developed an almost supernatural ability to remain still, to read the landscape, and to understand the subtle patterns of nature that most people never notice. He was small in stature, standing just 5 feet tall, which would later prove to be a significant advantage in combat. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, humble man who excelled at skiing and shooting competitions, but nobody could have predicted that this unassuming farmer would become one of history's most effective killers. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland on November 30, 1939, the attack came as part of Stalin's broader strategy to create buffer zones around Soviet territory. The invasion, which would become known as the Winter War, was predicated on the assumption that Finland would capitulate quickly. Soviet leadership believed their massive numerical superiority would overwhelm the Finns in a matter of weeks, perhaps even days. They had reason for confidence. The Soviet forces outnumbered the Finnish defenders by more than 3 to 1, and their material advantage was even more staggering. But the Soviets had failed to account for the Finnish concept of sisu, a cultural characteristic that roughly translates to extraordinary determination, courage, and resilience in the face of adversity. They also hadn't counted on the terrain, the weather, or men like Simo Häyhä. Häyhä was 34 years old when he was called to serve in the 6th Company of JR-34, a Finnish infantry regiment defending the Kala River region. This area was strategically vital, and the Soviets threw wave after wave of soldiers against the Finnish positions. The temperature regularly dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes and turn machine gun oil into useless sludge. The days were short, with only a few hours of weak sunlight, and the nights were pitch black and endless. In these conditions, Häyhä began his work. He was armed with a Finnish M28-30 rifle, a variant of the Soviet Mosin-Nagant that had been modified for Finnish use. Crucially, Häyhä refused to use a telescopic sight on his rifle, relying instead on the weapon's standard iron sights. This decision, which might seem counterintuitive, was actually brilliant tactical thinking. A scope could fog up in the extreme cold, its glass could reflect sunlight and give away his position, and it required the shooter to raise his head higher above cover. Häyhä kept his profile as low as possible, making himself nearly invisible against the snow. His hunting experience proved invaluable in combat. Häyhä understood that successful sniping wasn't about making impossible shots from extreme distances. It was about patience, positioning, and consistency. He would arrive at his chosen position hours before dawn, moving silently through the forest on skis. He wore simple white camouflage, often just a white snowsuit that he made himself, and he would pack snow in front of his position to prevent the muzzle blast from kicking up powder that might reveal his location. He kept snow in his mouth to prevent his breath from creating visible vapor in the frozen air. These were techniques he developed as a hunter, but in war, they became the difference between life and death. Häyhä would lie motionless in the snow for hours, sometimes for an entire day, waiting for Soviet soldiers to enter his kill zone. His small stature meant he could conceal himself in positions that would be impossible for larger men. He could shoot from behind logs, from inside snowbanks, from positions so cramped and uncomfortable that most soldiers wouldn't last an hour, let alone an entire day. The Soviet forces in the Kala sector began to experience something they'd never encountered before: systematic, invisible death. Soldiers would be talking one moment and dead the next, a single bullet having found them from an unknown location. Officers were particular targets. Häyhä understood that killing leaders created confusion and degraded unit effectiveness. He would methodically work through Soviet positions, taking one shot, then remaining absolutely still, waiting to see if anyone had spotted him. If his position remained uncompromised, he would take another shot, and another, until the enemy either retreated or organized a response. The Soviets began to realize that someone extraordinary was operating in their sector. Bodies were piling up, always with the same characteristic: a single, perfectly placed shot. Reports began flowing up the Soviet chain of command about a Finnish sniper who seemed to be everywhere at once, who could kill from any distance, who never missed. What made Häyhä truly exceptional wasn't just his shooting ability. It was his tactical intelligence and his understanding of combat psychology. He never stayed in one position for too long. He would take a few shots, then move to an entirely different location before the Soviets could organize counter-sniper operations. He understood that patterns got snipers killed, so he constantly varied his methods, his positions, and his timing. Sometimes he would shoot from maximum range, forcing the Soviets to search a wide area. Other times he would get dangerously close, shooting from positions so near the Soviet lines that they never thought to look there. He would shoot at different times of day, from different angles, creating the impression that there were multiple snipers operating in the sector. This psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Soviet soldiers became afraid to move during daylight. They would hear about the White Death from troops in other sectors, and the legend grew with each telling. Some reports claimed he could shoot through small gaps in fortifications. Others said he could hit targets at impossible ranges. The reality was frightening enough. Häyhä was simply better than anyone the Soviets could field against him. The Soviet command tried everything to eliminate him. They organized dedicated counter-sniper teams, sending some of their best marksmen to hunt for the White Death. Häyhä killed them all. They tried artillery bombardments, shelling areas where they thought he might be operating. Häyhä would simply move to a different sector and continue his work. They attempted coordinated infantry sweeps, with large numbers of soldiers moving through the forests trying to flush him out. He would hide, let them pass, then resume shooting from a different angle. The Soviets even brought in specialized units with better equipment and training, but nothing worked. The body count continued to climb: 20 kills, 50 kills, 100 kills. The numbers became almost abstract, but each one represented a Soviet soldier who would never go home, and each death further demoralized the invading forces. Häyhä's success wasn't just about individual marksmanship. It was having a strategic impact on Soviet operations in the Kala sector. The Red Army began changing their tactics specifically because of him and snipers like him. Soviet soldiers started moving only at night, despite the extreme danger of operating in pitch-black conditions in -40-degree weather. They began using smoke screens during the day to obscure Finnish sight lines, which slowed their advances and consumed resources. Command posts were moved further from the front lines, degrading communication effectiveness. Soviet officers stopped wearing their distinctive uniforms at the front, instead dressing like regular soldiers to avoid being targeted. Supply operations became nightmares of logistical complexity, as the Soviets tried to minimize exposure to Finnish snipers. All of these changes had cascading effects on Soviet combat effectiveness, and all of them stemmed from the Red Army's desperate need to counter the threat posed by men like Häyhä. By January 1940, Häyhä's kill count had passed 200, though even he wasn't entirely certain of the exact number. The Finnish military didn't have the luxury of careful record-keeping during the desperate fighting of the Winter War. Häyhä's confirmed kills were those witnessed by other soldiers or officers, but there were certainly many more that went unrecorded. He was also operating with a submachine gun during close-quarters combat, and those kills brought his estimated total even higher. His fellow soldiers were in awe of him, but Häyhä remained characteristically humble. He would return from his daily missions, clean his rifle, eat his rations, and sleep, then wake up before dawn to do it all again. There was no bravado, no boasting, just the quiet professionalism of a man doing a job that needed to be done. His company commander would later say that Häyhä never spoke about his kills and seemed uncomfortable with the attention his success was generating. The legend of the White Death spread beyond the battlefield. Finnish newspapers began reporting on the mysterious sniper who was single-handedly holding back Soviet advances. The stories were good for Finnish morale during a war that was going badly in many other sectors. While the propaganda may have exaggerated some details, the fundamental truth was undeniable. Simo Häyhä was the deadliest sniper in history, and he was becoming a symbol of Finnish resistance. The Soviets became obsessed with killing him. They increased the bounty on his head. They sent more specialized units. They employed new tactics specifically designed to counter his methods. But Häyhä continued to survive and continued to kill. His understanding of the forest, his infinite patience, and his absolute discipline made him nearly impossible to counter. Then, on March 6, 1940, just days before the war would end, the impossible happened. Häyhä was in his position as usual, engaging Soviet forces, when an enemy soldier managed to hit him with an explosive bullet to his lower left jaw. The injury was catastrophic. The bullet destroyed much of his lower face, and by all rights, it should have killed him instantly. His comrades found him unconscious and bleeding heavily into the snow. They carried him back to Finnish lines, certain he would die before they could get him to medical care. Häyhä remained in a coma for several days while Finnish doctors worked frantically to save his life. The left side of his face was effectively destroyed, and the doctors had to perform multiple surgeries just to keep him alive. He finally regained consciousness on March 13, 1940. The very day the Winter War ended with a Soviet-Finnish armistice. The armistice came at a devastating cost to Finland. The country was forced to cede significant territory to the Soviet Union, including the entire Karelian Isthmus and other strategic areas. Roughly 12% of Finland's pre-war territory was lost, and over 400,000 Finns became refugees from the ceded lands. But Finland had achieved something remarkable. It had survived. The Soviet Union had failed to conquer the nation, suffering catastrophic casualties in the process. Estimates of Soviet dead ranged from 150,000 to over 300,000, compared to roughly 25,000 Finnish casualties. The Winter War had been a humiliation for Stalin and the Red Army, and it had demonstrated to the world that the Soviet military was far less capable than its propaganda suggested. This perception would have significant implications, likely contributing to Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union just over a year later. Simo Häyhä woke from his coma to find the war over and his face permanently disfigured. The injuries required years of reconstructive surgery, and even then, the left side of his face would never look normal again. He was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant by Field Marshal Mannerheim, an extraordinary jump in rank that reflected the high regard in which he was held. But the war had extracted a terrible price from the quiet farmer. His face would cause him pain for the rest of his life, and he struggled with the psychological aftermath of his combat experiences. Like many soldiers, he rarely spoke about what he had done or what he had seen. When journalists would later ask him how he became such an effective sniper, his answers were characteristically modest and practical. He practiced a lot, he understood the forest, and he did what was necessary for Finland. After the war, Häyhä returned to farming and hunting, trying to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. Finland was drawn back into conflict with the Soviet Union in 1941 when Germany invaded the USSR and Finland saw an opportunity to reclaim its lost territories. This conflict, known as the Continuation War, lasted until 1944, but Häyhä did not participate in frontline combat due to his injuries. He lived quietly in Finland through the Cold War era, generally avoiding publicity and rarely giving interviews. When he did speak about the war, he would emphasize the collective effort of all Finnish soldiers rather than his individual achievements. He became a successful businessman and hunter, and he lived to see Finland transform from a war-torn nation into one of the world's most prosperous and peaceful countries. The full extent of Häyhä's achievement becomes clear when you consider the context and the constraints under which he operated. He was fighting in some of the most extreme weather conditions imaginable, where simply surviving was a challenge before you even considered combat. He was using a relatively basic rifle without optical enhancement, making his accuracy even more remarkable. He was vastly outnumbered, often operating in sectors where Soviet forces had overwhelming numerical superiority. And he did all of this in just 100 days of active combat, a time frame so compressed that it makes his kill count almost incomprehensible. To average 5 kills per day for 100 consecutive days, under those conditions, represents a level of skill and dedication that borders on the superhuman. Military historians and sniper instructors still study Häyhä's tactics and methods. His emphasis on field craft over pure marksmanship, his understanding of psychology and morale, and his ability to adapt to changing battlefield conditions are all lessons that remain relevant. Modern snipers learn about the importance of patience from Häyhä's example. He would wait hours for a single perfect shot rather than taking multiple rush shots that might compromise his position. They study his camouflage and concealment techniques, many of which are still taught in military sniper schools. His decision to avoid using a telescopic sight, which seemed counterintuitive at first, actually demonstrated a deeper understanding of the operational environment and the specific challenges of winter warfare. In an era of high-tech equipment and advanced optics, there's something profound about the fact that the deadliest sniper in history achieved his success with iron sights, patience, and an intimate knowledge of his environment. The Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged how much damage Häyhä and other Finnish snipers inflicted on their forces during the Winter War. Soviet records from the period are notoriously unreliable, often minimizing casualties and obscuring tactical failures. But the evidence of Häyhä's impact is undeniable. The tactical changes the Red Army implemented, the resources devoted to counter-sniper operations, and the psychological effect his presence had on Soviet troops in the Kala sector. He tied down Soviet forces, killed key personnel, and created an atmosphere of fear that degraded enemy combat effectiveness. For a single soldier to have that level of strategic impact is almost unheard of in modern warfare, where battles are decided by artillery, air power, and mechanized forces rather than individual infantrymen. Häyhä's story also illuminates the broader narrative of the Winter War, a conflict that deserves to be better known in American military history. The sight of a small democratic nation standing up to a totalitarian superpower resonated with Americans at the time, even as the United States remained officially neutral. The Finnish resistance demonstrated that superior training, knowledge of terrain, and determination could partially offset numerical inferiority, lessons that would prove relevant as America entered World War II. The Winter War also exposed Soviet military weaknesses that Hitler would later exploit, making it a pivotal moment in the lead-up to Operation Barbarossa and the eventual Allied victory in Europe. Finland's survival, bought with the blood of soldiers like Häyhä, ensured that the country would never become another Soviet satellite state during the Cold War. Simo Häyhä lived until 2002, dying at the age of 96. He spent his final years in a veterans' nursing home, where he was reportedly cheerful and enjoyed visits from military historians and admirers. When asked late in life if he regretted killing so many people, he gave an answer that was both simple and profound. He was defending his country, and he did what was necessary. There was no glorification of violence, no pride in the death toll, just the stark acknowledgement that war had demanded these actions from him. In his final years, journalists would occasionally track him down for interviews, and they consistently reported being struck by his humility and his reluctance to be treated as a hero. He saw himself as one soldier among many, doing his duty for Finland, nothing more. The legacy of the White Death extends beyond military history into the realm of human capability, and the question of what individuals can achieve under extraordinary circumstances. Häyhä was not a professional soldier, or a military genius in the traditional sense. He was a farmer who happened to possess a specific set of skills that proved devastatingly effective in one particular type of warfare. His story raises fascinating questions about expertise and specialization. How many other people might possess latent talents that would only emerge under extreme circumstances? How much of success in any field comes from the match between individual capabilities and environmental demands? Häyhä's shooting ability was certainly exceptional, but it was the combination of that skill with his hunting experience, his knowledge of winter conditions, his mental discipline, and the specific tactical situation of the Winter War that created the legend. In an age of precision-guided munitions and drone strikes, there's something almost anachronistic about studying a sniper from 1939. Yet Häyhä's methods remain relevant because they're rooted in timeless principles: understanding your environment, knowing your enemy, patience, discipline, and the ability to operate effectively under extreme stress. These are qualities that transcend technology and remain crucial in military operations today. The White Death proved that a single skilled individual, properly deployed and supported, could have strategic effects on a battlefield. Modern special operations forces still operate on variations of this principle, sending small teams of highly trained soldiers to achieve objectives that might otherwise require much larger conventional forces. Simo Häyhä's story is ultimately one of capability meeting necessity. He didn't seek glory or fame. He was a reluctant warrior who rose to meet an existential threat to his nation. The fact that he survived the war, lived a long life, and remained humble about his achievements makes his story even more remarkable. In an era that often celebrates excess and self-promotion, there's something compelling about a man who was genuinely extraordinary but never sought recognition for it. The White Death earned his fearsome reputation not through bravado or aggression, but through quiet competence, discipline, and an unwavering commitment to protecting his homeland. That combination of deadly effectiveness and fundamental decency is rare in military history, and it's why Simo Häyhä remains a figure of fascination more than 80 years after he first took up position in the frozen forests of Finland.